Hello and welcome to A Wider World, a show on ability. I'm Elizabeth Kelly. How do we protect people with disabilities from falling victim to crime? How do we help people with disabilities to recognize abuse and report it, especially when the perpetrator is someone caring for the victim? What happens when a crime is committed, but the victim is not a good witness? Throughout the United States, crimes against people with disabilities, especially those with communication disabilities, go unprosecuted. The person is twice victimized, once by the perpetrator and again by the system that's supposed to protect us all. Let's take a look at what Massachusetts and Florida are doing to change this and how we can create our own local teams for justice.
Our country, generally, every year there are about 1 million substantiated cases of child abuse. And every year there are about 2 million elder abuse substantiated cases. And every year there are about 5 million substantiated cases of abuse of dependent adults. So in fact, there are more cases of vulnerable adults being crime victims in our country every year than child abuse and elder abuse combined.
The most stunning statistic is prior to the Building Partnership Initiative, there were, I believe, 32 cases that were referred for investigation, criminal investigation. None resulted in prosecution. This is statewide. We now have well over 100 cases, and sometimes it's difficult to actually capture the statistics accurately, but we have well over 100 cases that are prosecuted in court every single year, and it's made a tremendous difference for victims with disabilities. But not only those statistics, but the numbers that are being investigated and protective services put into place, even though they may not get to court and be disposed of in court, has increased tremendously.
If you or someone you love are unfortunate enough to become the victim of a crime, chances are you feel outrage, fear, violated. One of the things you count on is that the police will investigate and seek the arrest of the individual responsible for this horrible act. We trust that the perpetrator will be prosecuted and punished. But how would you feel if that didn't happen, and instead of help you were told to stop lying? What if you didn't have the language to describe what you've been through?
Because there are so many people that have been abused and that are still abused constantly, and they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go, how to report it, and what to do about it.
People with disabilities can become the victim of a crime. And when they become the victim of a crime, they need to know that there are rights afforded to them. And those rights were garnered through the advocacy of people in the victims' rights movement. But you have to know about your rights and what services are available to you in order to access them. Years ago we had advocates who were advocating for victims' rights. And everything changed with the passage of the Victims of Crime Act in 1984. And that was because it brought forth money, more money for crime victims' compensation, for direct service programs, and it really started filling out the entire field. And then, around the same time, there were advocates with disabilities who were advocating for inclusion and for rights for people with disabilities. And that really culminated in the landmark legislation of the 1990 ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. They were two distinctly separate, parallel systems. One was advocating for the rights of crime victims, the other advocating for the rights of people with disabilities.
The Building Partnership Initiative for the Protection of Persons with Disabilities, Building Partnership for short, or BPI, is a collaboration of law enforcement, disability organizations, adult protective services, sexual assault nurse examiners, self-advocates, and others to utilize a multidisciplinary approach when responding to violence committed against persons with disabilities. So much of the Building Partnership Initiative, the reason we're able to move forward is because of the enormous amount of training that has come out of Massachusetts. Not only, when I say training, it's more of a cross-training. Law enforcement is training adult protective services on basic investigation skills, on sexual assault skills, on interviewing skills. Adult protective services and the disability agencies and the self-advocates are training law enforcement on communicating with persons with disabilities, introducing them to the complex human service structure that exists in Massachusetts, and a variety of other issues. And so there's a lot of cross-training that's occurring between individuals and disciplines and organizations within Massachusetts. There's been curricula developed, for local and state police, for sexual assault nurse examiners, for adult protective service workers, for individuals that provide services to persons with disabilities. And currently we're working on curricula, in partnership with persons with disabilities to help persons with disabilities recognize, report, and respond effectively to abuse. So yes, quite a bit of training.
I'm someone who believes that there is always a common denominator. We may have to drill down far to get to that point, but there is a common denominator. In this case represents that, as well as any that I've been involved in, that we all shared the vision of protecting individuals with disabilities who were victims of crime or who might become a victim of a crime.
When he started getting the cases in a very short period of time, when we started the process shortly into it, 3 months later, I forget the exact number, but he had somewhere about 8 or 12 sexual assaults of persons with disabilities, that came to his table, and he said, "My gosh, what was happening to these cases prior to the involvement of prosecutors, prior to the involvement of district attorneys?" And he was able to answer that question himself. People were literally getting away with raping persons with disabilities without the involvement of the law enforcement system. So yes, it was a good question. He wanted to know how many cases he was getting, how he was going to have to absorb this additional work. But once he did that first case, he got the passion and recognized the need for it.
All the solutions don't come out of Washington, D.C. OVC has been instrumental in providing the funding, but the solutions all don't begin and end there. All the solutions do not begin and end with state government either. Many of the solutions that we can find to solving these issues are right in our own communities. So since I am part of a community, part of South Florida, I decided to start with what was most manageable. And through my position at the Attorney General's office, I'm also a trainer, which means we train all the victim advocates coming into the field, or those who have been there for a while and still need a refresher. It's a 32-hour block of training. It's called the Victim Practitioners Designation Training. And I expanded our topics to include people with disabilities who are victims of crime.
Most of the work that we've done has been without any legislative change. It's all been that sea change in the way we all communicate and work together, and we're increasing accessibility to the criminal justice system for victims with disabilities. I needed to understand what the rules and regulations were of the agencies, what their perspective was, what their goals were. Likewise, I believe those in the human service agencies needed to understand what law enforcement needed to do and how we operated. So we just communicated, began to build the relationships, and those relationships exist some 12 years later.
Indeed, advocates, service providers, law enforcement, and the criminal justice system all need to work together. Service providers need to understand what it takes to prosecute a case, and law enforcement needs to be knowledgeable on how to successfully communicate with the victim and resources that can improve this essential part of the victim's experience. Community teams can form at any level with existing resources. In your town, county, or state, utilize your experts to create the team and begin the process of teaching people with disabilities to report abuse. Help law enforcement with more effective communication techniques, and ensure that social service agencies understand the basics of interviewing crime victims and preserving the evidence. Borrow from existing models. There are many out there who are willing to share. Whether you are an advocate, work in law enforcement, or for a social service agency, the most important thing is to begin. For more information on developing community teams to educate and respond to crime victims with disabilities, visit the website of the Office for Victims of Crime.